So it was after midnight. We were meeting as the Joint Select Committee on the Parliamentary Budget Office so that we could talk live via satellite with officials from the Parliamentary Budget Office in Canada. Chair John Faulkner and Deputy Chair Chris Pine were a surprise unity ticket on the benefits of the model being presented. Of all the models around the world, this was the one Australia was about to copy. It was agreed across the Parliament that a Parliamentary Budget Office was an important reform. Those inside Parliament were completely at wit's end, relying on the dear old Parliamentary Library, a subjective media contact or two, or even the local family accountant for their macroeconomic guidance. And those outside of Parliament were always surprised when told MPs have no access to any timely, detailed information about the national economy or accounts, not from Treasury, not from anyone. Indeed, what the trend of our modern system was showing was a public sector increasingly astute at providing less detail to MPs through FOI retractions, cabinet in confidence redefinitions, bland non-answers in questions with or without notice, or any number of the committee process answers. Timely and accurate advice was all but non-existent for the actual people holding the purse of the national budget. Thankfully, a PBO in modern public governance is now filling this gap, giving people access to real-time, independent information on the national accounts, so as to hold the executive to account better than before. Better information makes for better parliamentary decisions. Timely information makes for timely parliamentary decisions. It's really pretty simple. Without getting too deep in theory, the Parliamentary Budget Officer sits alongside the Auditor-General as the two key independent economic officers who work specifically for the Parliament. They are independent of the Crown, independent of ministers, and independent of the government of the day. They are independent voices to Parliament on all things audit, oversight and economy. So that, fellow PBO travellers, was an extract from my first draft of a book I wrote in 2014. Sadly, most of this was edited out and lies on the floor of Allen and Unwin under a factory in North Sydney somewhere. The experts in bookselling world said the institutional architecture of parliamentary reform is hardly a page-turner. So where, oh where were all of you? All 200 plus conference goers here today when I needed you the most. But it's okay, because I knew the day would come where I got to share the enthralling, riveting, can't put it down, page-turning joy of how the PBO was formed. So to Stein and all at the PBO team, thank you for the invite here today. It's the first time I've actually set foot back in the building over 9 years ago, and so far I haven't felt any trauma issues, but still working on it. And thank you to all in the room or online for attending, for it signals there are some who understand the importance of modernising our institutional architecture in support of the ultimate goal of the best possible national policy. And I'm just going to break. So I'll just have these on in the background. The PBO may never draw the big fanfare crowd of hysteric popularity, but that's because the PBO is not part of the circus. It is the hard and, dare I say, boring grind of quality, timely advice to individual parliamentarians and the broader Parliament. This is despite all citizens owing a debt of gratitude for some of the advice provided so far. During COVID, for example, it was the PBO that revealed the billions of overpaid job seeker waste as just one of its, on average, 1,600 pieces of advice per year. And I'd like to say that I worked that out based on your graph. You know, that was just a bit of quick data crunching. And we not only owe a debt of gratitude for these quality gems of advice, but more broadly for fulfilling your brief as a successful institutional reform. The PBO is now a shining light for those concerned about a fracturing of democracy, those concerned about the damage from misinformation wars, or those concerned about reform gridlock. Those concerns are real and corroborated by data. In 2012, Australia was ranked the 5th least corrupt country in the world by Transparency International. A decade later, in the January 2022 report, Australia has now slipped to 18th. 18th. What's happened while I've been away? In an era defined by growing threats to democracy, from technology to foreign actors to rising political extremism, there has never been a more urgent time to solidify and maximise public trust in democratic systems. So just as important as the timely advice for individual MPs, the PBO is now a really important example of how we counterpunch misinformation and gridlock. For example, the PBO will be studied closely by those assigned to establishing the National Anti-Corruption Commission as it takes its shape over the coming 12 months. Having a pre-existing working model of an independent body reporting to Parliament will assist this process immensely. The PBO is also a touchstone of the possible for those calling for reforms to our parliamentary accountability structures, whether it's whistleblower protection, donation reform and lobbying regulation, or truth in advertising. And, all importantly, constitutionally, as we're all asked to accept the invitation to walk with First Nations communities in the Uluru Statement from the Heart, to enshrine a First Nations voice in the Constitution and to establish a Makarrata Commission to enable processes of treaty and truth-telling, it is the Parliamentary Budget Office and the Australian National Audit Office that I think about most when I think what an Indigenous voice to Parliament might look like. And due to the significance of this emerging national conversation, I do ask for a couple of minutes of indulgence to spend some time on this voice to Parliament. For it is an important direct comparison for political leaders to reflect upon, that they, in a bipartisan way, readily accepted independent voices to Parliament on complex topics, such as the administrative disputes with an Ombudsman's office, audit and oversight with the National Audit Office, and national accounts and election costings with the PBO. Logically then, like these other independent bodies, an Indigenous voice to Parliament would enhance parliamentary debate and enhance decision-making for all of us. It is not hard to see that successive parliaments have been overwhelmed and unable to address the significant issues of childhood poverty, over-incarceration, literacy, life expectancy, and childhood mortality, to name just a few. Tomorrow, I'm attending a meeting about rheumatic heart disease within Australia, something that is entirely preventable and yet remains prevalent throughout Australia's rural and remote Indigenous populations. For a country with one of the best health systems in the world, to have such failure in health policy is a cry for help. Put simply, Parliament itself has a history of being a structural contributor to the gap, rather than an instrument with the ability to close the gap. Our Parliament needs the help of First Nations people like Paul to understand complexity in order to deliver for all. And like the PBO reform, the Makarrata Commission and Voice to Parliament is a reform of practical consequence. On average now, as has been said, the PBO is issuing 1,600 pieces of direct advice per year on the national accounts and election costings. Depending how you look at this is just under 5 pieces of direct advice per day, or approximately 10 pieces of economic advice per MP per year. By comparison, and in no way to make a point to shame or embarrass anyone, I think I could name on one hand the Australian MPs who I would put money on to correctly name, let alone spell, 10, or Murra, 10 of the First Nations 200 lands around Australia. That's a mere 5% of the overall lands. And I emphasise, I don't say this to shame nor embarrass, but to emphasise it is members of Parliament who will benefit the most from the kind and gracious offer of a voice to Parliament, and with that we all benefit from better decisions. So while I love that I was part of the PBO reform and that it is heralded by the likes of the Grattan Institute as the economic reform of the past decade, an Indigenous voice to Parliament is the democratic reform of our lifetime. What the PBO provides is an important, practical, working example of what can be done when we provide the right pathway for sensible, timely advice. So, ladies and gentlemen, I was honoured to have struck the initial agreement in 2010 to make the PBO happen. I was honoured to participate after midnight in the detailed ideas on the actual model throughout 2011. I was honoured to vote in support of the enabling legislation in 2012. And I was also honoured, as Chair of the Public Accounts Committee, to introduce the first Parliamentary Budget Officer, Phil Bowen, to the Parliament in 2012. And equally so, I'm honoured to join you here today for your 10th birthday, because it is just so pleasing to know the PBO's survived the decade of division. Now, feedback surveys are always subjective. They never tell you everything, but they do tell you something. They are worthwhile for general trends. To say you have a 92% satisfaction rating is commendable and shows the necessity of this institution. That the small criticism of the service is that you're too slow to reach the crossbench MPs is a call for more resourcing and a call for more, not less. It is, in a way, a backhanded compliment that should hopefully motivate you all into the next decade. And if the first 10 years were about settling into the job, there is now an opportunity to review your scope, and we discussed some of that about MOUs with state agencies as just one example. And hopefully you now are in a position to reach more widely. Because as is known by all in the room, I think, a lot of economic activity of government happens around and even off budget. MPs have always struggled getting line of sight of these activities when substantial amounts of taxpayers' money are involved. The PBO can play a role, like with the job seeker example, in shining the light of transparency in some areas of government activity long overdue for some audit, accountability and oversight. So the PBO is a good example of timely national reform. I do hope more and more Australians do come to recognise this, and that we all as Australians challenge ourselves further to not only support this institution, but to expand the idea further, such as through the National Anti-Corruption Commission or through a Makarrata Commission. Because it is the success of the PBO over the past decade that allows us to believe it can be done. So happy birthday and enjoy the day.